On February 8, 2007, Anna Nicole Smith collapsed in a hotel room in Florida, and the news spread with the speed and violence that only follows the fall of someone the world had already turned into spectacle. She was 39 years old. By the time officials later confirmed that she had died from an accidental overdose of prescription drugs, the image had already fixed itself in the public imagination. The blonde bombshell, the Playboy fantasy, the tabloid obsession, suddenly reduced to a body in a hotel room while cameras and headlines closed in from every direction. That is where this story has to begin. Not with glamour, not with fame, but with the cold brutality of that ending. Because Anna Nicole Smith was never treated like an ordinary celebrity while she was alive. She was consumed. She was watched, argued over, mocked, desired, and turned into a public symbol of sex, scandal, money, and excess. Reuters reported that there was no evidence of foul play or illegal drugs, only a fatal mixture of prescription medication that ended weeks of uncertainty after her death. But facts alone cannot explain why that moment hit so hard. What died in that room was not just a former playmate. It was one of the loudest fantasies the tabloids had ever built. The woman who had once seemed to live entirely inside the logic of attention, now gone in a silence so ugly and so unromantic that it shattered the myth all at once. And what made Anna Nicole Smith's death so haunting was that the world already knew how to tell her story before it understood her. To the public, she had long been the woman who went from a Walmart checkout girl in Texas to Playboy fame, guest campaigns, a headline-making marriage to 89-year-old oil tycoon J. Howard Marshall, and years of relentless legal and tabloid chaos. People summed up that rise with almost cruel efficiency, from Walmart checkout girl to Playboy pinup. That framing matters, because it reveals how completely her life had been turned into a narrative of transformation and consumption. She was not allowed to simply become famous. She had to become a myth people could stare at, a fantasy with a background poor enough to make the reinvention dramatic, a body public enough to make the fame exploitable, and a personal life messy enough to keep the cameras fed. By the time she died, that myth had already started to rot. Her son Daniel had died only months earlier, just after the birth of her daughter Dannylyn, and Reuters noted that Anna Nicole had suffered severe depression after that loss. So when the end came, the real question was no longer whether the tabloids would erupt. They always would. The question was how a woman who had been made to look larger than life could end in such visible ruin. How did Vicki Lynn Hogan, the young woman from Texas who once believed she could become somebody, turn into Anna Nicole Smith, a public obsession so overexposed that the world noticed the collapse only when it was already too late? That is the wound at the center of this story. Long before the tabloids turned her into a blonde fantasy, Anna Nicole Smith was Vicki Lynn Hogan, a young woman from Texas trying to outrun a life that already felt too small, too hard, and too unforgiving. She was born in Houston in 1967, grew up in a fractured family, and left school while still very young. By her late teens, she was already married and already a mother, which matters because it gives the early part of her story a different emotional shape from the myth people later built around her. Before the glamour, before the Playboy covers, before the courtroom wars and television chaos, there was a girl trying to survive ordinary life with very little protection. She worked where she could, lived with the limits that poverty imposes on ambition, and carried the kind of restless desire that often grows inside people who feel they were not meant to stay where they began. Texas history sources trace that version of her life clearly. The teenage marriage, the birth of her son Daniel, and the unstable early years before fame had given her a new name to hide inside. This is the Anna Nicole that matters in part 2, not the tabloid creation, but the young mother who had not yet become a symbol, only a person trying to escape the gravity of her own beginnings. That escape did not begin with celebrity. It began with reinvention. In the early 1990s, while working as a dancer in Houston, Vicki Lynn Hogan started moving toward the image that would eventually become Anna Nicole Smith. People later compressed that transformation into a cruelly simple line, from Walmart checkout girl to Playboy pinup. But what that summary hides is the desperation and willpower inside it. She was not casually drifting toward fame. She was trying to manufacture a new future out of beauty, risk, and visibility before the old life closed around her completely. People recounts that just a few years after earning very little as a Walmart checkout girl and raising her child as a single mother, she sent nude photos to Playboy and landed the photo shoot that changed everything. That detail is important, not because it is sensational, but because it captures the exact moment reinvention became real. The woman who would later be consumed as Anna Nicole Smith first had to invent Anna Nicole at all. She took the raw materials the world seemed willing to notice, her body, her image, her willingness to be seen, and used them as a ladder out. That is what gives this phase of her life its weight. Before she became the guess girl, before she married money, before the cameras made her famous and then devoured her, she was a young woman trying to transform vulnerability into opportunity. And for a brief moment, it worked. The transformation from Vicki Lynn Hogan into Anna Nicole Smith became real in the early 1990s, when reinvention stopped being private ambition and turned into public spectacle. In 1992, after sending nude photos to Playboy, she broke through as a model, and the following year she was named Playmate of the Year. Around that same period, she also became one of the striking faces of Guess, where the campaign imagery deliberately leaned into the Marilyn Monroe comparison that would follow her for years. That matters because Anna Nicole did not rise as a normal celebrity with a carefully balanced image. She rose as a fantasy. Blonde, curvy, dramatic, half pinup and half performance, the kind of woman the culture did not merely admire but consumed. She was not introduced to the public as a person with a difficult past who had fought her way out of Texas hardship. She was introduced as a symbol of desire, excess, and reinvention made flesh. The camera did not ask who she had been. It asked what she could become in front of it. And for a brief, dazzling stretch, that answer seemed almost limitless. She moved from magazine pages into films, headlines, and fashion culture, and the fantasy only grew stronger because she looked as though she had stepped out of an older American myth and into the tabloid age. Anna Nicole Smith was not merely becoming famous. She was becoming recognizable in the deepest way celebrity culture can make a person recognizable, not as herself, but as an image the public can immediately project onto. That is why this part of her life has to feel seductive. The rise was real. The glamour was real. The power of being suddenly seen after years of feeling trapped was real. But so was the danger hidden inside it. Because once a woman becomes famous through fantasy, the world often stops allowing her to be human at all. Then came the stage when fascination turned into obsession. In 1994, Anna Nicole Smith married J. Howard Marshall II, the 89-year-old oil tycoon whose age and fortune transformed the relationship into one of the biggest celebrity scandals of the decade. The marriage did not just increase her fame, it changed its texture. From that point on, she was no longer simply the Playboy model who had broken through into mainstream visibility. She became a tabloid myth, the blonde bombshell, the widow, the woman accused of chasing money, the center of endless judgment, mockery, voyeurism, and legal conflict. After Marshall's death in 1995, she spent years fighting over his estate, and the story became inseparable from her public identity. By the early 2000s, another transformation began. In The Anna Nicole Show, which ran from 2002 to 2004, the fantasy started to crack in full view of the audience. Viewers no longer saw only the polished image from the Guess campaigns or the Playboy mythology. They saw confusion, disorientation, chaos, and a woman who often seemed unable to keep up with the pace of her own life. That made her more compelling to the public, but it also made her more vulnerable. What people were watching by then was not just fame, it was distortion. Anna Nicole Smith had become the kind of celebrity the culture could feed on endlessly because she seemed to contain everything at once: sex, sadness, comedy, scandal, beauty, grief, and instability. That is the true climax of Part 3. She did not simply become a star. She became a machine for headlines, a figure too public to protect and too profitable to be left alone. The woman who had used reinvention as a ladder out of obscurity was now trapped inside the larger-than-life version of herself the world most wanted to watch. And once that happened, the distance between fame and ruin began to disappear. If Anna Nicole Smith's life had already begun to crack under the pressure of fame, then the death of her son Daniel shattered whatever was left holding her together. In September 2006, just 3 days after she gave birth to her daughter Danilyn in the Bahamas, Daniel died in her hospital room at age 20. Later, a Bahamian jury ruled that he died of an accidental drug overdose. That loss changed the emotional meaning of Anna Nicole's final months. The public still saw the same blonde icon, the same chaotic celebrity, the same woman surrounded by lawyers, cameras, gossip, and headlines. But underneath that public image was a mother collapsing under a grief so sudden and so intimate that it seemed to tear the center out of her life. Reuters later reported that Anna Nicole suffered severe depression after Daniel's death, and that detail matters because it explains why the final chapter of her story feels so much darker than ordinary celebrity scandal. This was no longer just a woman trapped inside tabloids, lawsuits, and a public identity she could no longer control. This was a grieving mother moving through the wreckage of a loss that the world could observe, but never really understand. The spectacle kept going around her anyway. There were continuing legal battles over Danilyn's paternity, endless media obsession, and the same relentless hunger from the public to consume every crisis as entertainment. But once Daniel died, the energy of the story changed. What had once looked like excess now began to look like damage. What had once looked like melodrama began to look like someone emotionally unraveling in real time. And that is what makes Anna Nicole Smith so haunting. The fantasy did not simply fade, it broke under the weight of grief. The woman who had spent years being reduced to her body, her marriage, her money battles, and her headlines was now carrying something much more devastating than scandal. She was carrying a dead son, and the world still would not stop watching. 5 months later, on February 8, 2007, Anna Nicole Smith collapsed at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Florida. In August, Florida officials concluded that she died from an accidental overdose of prescription drugs with no evidence of foul play. By then, the ending already felt grotesquely complete. The woman who had once been sold to the world as fantasy had been consumed so publicly that even her death arrived as another media storm. But behind the headlines was a far sadder truth. A woman devastated by grief, worn down by drugs, exhaustion, and years of being turned into a story other people profited from. Her burial only deepened the strange, tragic symbolism of the ending. After weeks of legal fighting over her remains, Anna Nicole was buried in the Bahamas, next to Daniel. Reuters described doves being released into the sky as she was laid to rest, and visual archives from the funeral show the hearse, the church service in Nassau, crowds around the procession, and the grave site that would become yet another place of public fascination. That ending says everything about the life that came before it. Anna Nicole Smith had spent years being treated as a spectacle too big, too blonde, too scandalous, too absurd, too glamorous, too broken to be seen clearly. Yet when the cameras finally reached the grave, the story became brutally simple. It was no longer about Playboy guests, the oil tycoon, the court battles, or the reality show. It was about a woman who had tried to climb out of poverty through reinvention, only to become trapped inside a public myth so large that it devoured the person underneath. That is why her story still lingers. Anna Nicole Smith was never just a scandal. She was a warning about what happens when the world mistakes exposure for love, attention for care, and spectacle for understanding. In the end, the bombshell, the widow, the tabloid icon, and the reality show chaos all disappeared. What remained was a mother buried beside her son in the Bahamas, and the uncomfortable truth that behind one of the loudest public lives of her era was a loneliness the world did not notice until the silence had already won.